Happy Halloween! Welcome to QXChurch. You can find us online at QXChurch.org. This is Pastor Scott Conway, and this is my Halloween sermon. No, actually, it's not really a Halloween sermon. It's actually something else that happened on October 31st in history. But happy Halloween, at least around our neighborhood, it's the weekend before Halloween. And there's been the Halloween parties and costumes all over and events going on all over town. And a lot of Christians like to avoid these things or go to an alternative harvest festival, and some people oppose that as well. For us at QXChurch, we don't have a problem with Halloween. We don't cede any day to the enemy. That to us, it's another holiday to practice. Halloween began as All Hallowed Eve, the Eve of All Saints' Day. But that's still not what we're talking about today. We're still not talking about All Hallowed Eve. We're not talking about All Saints' Day. We're talking about a day that changed everything. A day without which we would not exist here today. A day without which Christianity, as it is known by millions of people across this country, around this world, would not or might not exist. A day that changed everything. October 31st. The day that now we know as Halloween. If you ask anyone what's October 31st, the vast majority of people are going to tell you that's Halloween, obviously. But October 31st, 1517, what happened on that day? On that particular All Hallowed Eve. On that, what would be now Halloween. October 31st, 1517, the day that changed everything. There was a Catholic monk. And of course, there was a Catholic monk back then. You were a Christian. You pretty much were Catholic. You might have been Orthodox, but you were part of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, that still acknowledged the general authority of the bishops, the general authority of the Pope. So a Catholic monk whose name you may have heard, Dr. Martin Luther. Not to be confused with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was not alive in 1517. But on October 31st, 1517, the Catholic monk, Dr. Martin Luther, walked up to the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And as was a custom when one wished to post something publicly and initiate debate, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door. Now, if you've never heard of this, it was questions he had, disputes he had, positions he wanted to assert, put together in a list of 95 thesis statements, 95 assertions that he wished to have part of public debate, that he wished to discuss, that he wished to argue for. And that day is also known, not just as Halloween, but that day is also known as Reformation Day. The day that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Castle Church and sparked the Protestant Revolution. The Protestant Reformation. So Reformation Day and the Protestant Reformation, which really was a revolution, but we call it the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's act, was evidently intended by Luther to start a debate over indulgences and a series of theological issues. Now, essentially what an indulgence was, that if you're going to build it off of the vocabulary we use today, is that you could pay to kind of almost buy yourself permission to commit a sin. Or you could commit the sin and you could pay to have that sin absolved. And that's what it turned into. Now, that's not what indulgences were originally for. They were originally related to purgatory and making a sacrifice or a service or something to the Catholic Church to try to help earn your way out of purgatory, to earn a family member's way or another loved one's way out of purgatory. And it kind of evolved into basically a money-making scheme. You send us money and we'll give you a free pass. And that's what it had been turning into. And that hopefully obviously, is a bit of a problem. And Martin Luther, and probably a lot of other people, had a problem with this. Now here's one of the basic challenges you have in the Catholic Church. That for a while, from the book of Acts, moving forward from there, leaders were called by leaders. The Holy Spirit would descend upon people and would raise people up by the authority of God Himself. Provided, of course, you believe in that. But it was God who appointed the leaders. It was a call to ministry that called people into Christian leadership. And for a long time, the bishops that ran things, the inheritors of the authority of the apostles, basically committed Christians would rise up in church leadership. And that's the way things were done. But after a while, and somehow this kind of became a tradition, you would have the noble families, the wealthy families, the landed families, the titled families. And if I was a count or a duke or an earl somewhere, if I had a son, my son would inherit my title. He would receive the title and the lands and the wealth and the businesses and the revenue. But if I had a second son, and the first son didn't die, well, what do I do with the second son? Well, I could give him some land and some titles, but by tradition, that's supposed to go to my first son. And then it's up to him how much or whether or not he wishes to take care of his brothers and his sisters. So a tradition that arose was that if you were a second son, you went into the priesthood. And then if you were a third son, you went into the military. And this tradition arose. Now here's a question. Do you suppose that God automatically called every second-born son of every noble family throughout all of Europe? Throughout all of Western Asia? I think we can probably agree that answer is probably no. But that's the tradition that arose. So what started to happen is you have priests who have an allegiance to a noble family, to political families, as much, perhaps more, than to the church, than to Christ Himself. This creates a problem. Ultimately, one of the challenges that began to arise is that you would have these estates that would get passed from father to son amongst the priesthood. And what was happening is these congregations, these geographic locations, the land upon which churches were founded, the property owned and operated as a church was actually owned by the priests and was being passed through the priesthood like it was a new nobility. Now, one of the things, if you know a little bit about the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church in particular, their priests are allowed to marry. If you're a Catholic priest, you're not allowed to marry. Now, one of the reasons that arose is the slow evolving division between the Latin Church, which was the Roman Catholics, and the Eastern Church, or the Greek Church, which became the Greek Orthodox, and basically divided whether they spoke Latin or spoke Greek, began to arise, ultimately resulting in a kind of an official schism that is officially defined as a time when the Bishop of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome kind of excommunicated one another. Now, the Greek Church and the Latin Church still cooperated together on a lot of things in the years, the centuries even since then, just as they had been sort of slowly dividing in the ways of practices and a lot of the things that they did in the years, the centuries before then. And the decision that the Catholic priests were not allowed to marry, so that therefore they wouldn't have children and wouldn't be able to pass things down for children, was made after that time. So the Catholic Church, through the Pope and the bishops and the cardinals, were trying to solve some of these problems and some level of success. And so that was a solution that came in after that particular schism arose. But other problems continue to arise because you still have second sons going into the priesthood. And so one of the challenges that Christianity had, because Christianity was essentially the Catholic Church, was that the second sons were largely in control. And so you had a lot of political decisions being made, a lot of very, very human decisions being made. Sometimes what we might call some carnal decisions, some fleshly decisions, some materialistic decisions being made because one wasn't called into ministry by the moving and stirring of the Holy Spirit. One was automatically sent into ministry by virtue of being born a second son. Now, of course, I'm sure there were always people who were called into ministry. There were always people who were devout. But a lot of the movers and the shakers within the church became these second sons because they were the ones, because of the family contacts, that a great number of tithes would come through, that the power base, the influence of the church in politics and in government, the finances of the church would flow to the church because of and through and on behalf of these second sons. So there were a lot of very, very human problems. And a lot of people, not just Martin Luther, he wasn't the sole voice crying in the wilderness, had a problem with a lot of the things that were going on in the name of God. Really not so different from what we have today. There's a lot of people today that have a big problem with a lot of things being done in the name of God. And a lot of very godly people that have very strong disagreements over things being done in the name of Jesus Christ. A lot of people of a variety of religions that have a very serious problem with people taking action in the name of their religion, in the name of their God, in the name of their Savior, in the name of their Lord, in the name of their prophet. And then that becomes what a lot of people know about. A lot of people have this problem. So basically what you're talking about is a human problem. Well, this very human problem was happening in 1517 as well. So on October 31st, 1517, when Catholic monk Dr. Martin Luther walked up to the church, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church, there were a lot of people ready and willing to listen to him, who already agreed with a lot of the things he had to say, who would have looked at the 95 Theses, and those who were literate and could read it themselves, and those who heard it, agreed with a lot of what he had to say, had a problem with a lot of the things he had a problem with. And it became an issue. So Reformation Day and the Protestant Reformation, this revolution that started at Castle Church and touched off a spark that spread a Protestant wildfire across Europe, started off as an effort to do some reformation within the Catholic Church. In the beginning, Dr. Martin Luther didn't intend on splitting from the church. He was a Catholic monk. He intended to bring reformation into the church. It truly seemed as though his original intention, he wanted to bring the favor of God upon the Catholic Church, to draw the Catholics into relationship with Christ. That he sought originally to see a setting aside of so many of these very humanistic, materialistic, carnal, fleshly practices, and some sort of a restoration of God as primary, the call of God as primary, relationship with God as primary, and to step out from behind this political body that the church had in some significant degree become, and let people come straight to God. and to be able to teach these things from the Holy Scriptures, even to allow the Holy Scriptures to be made available for the common man, the common literate man to read. And some of these revolutionary ideas. But while his starting goal may have been Catholic Reformation, Luther's ideas were found not just incorrect. If you're going to debate someone, it might be because you just think he's wrong. You think he's mistaken. Maybe he has a point, but you disagree with his conclusions. You argue it, you debate it, you discuss it, you show him the error of his ways. But his ideas were not just found incorrect, they were found by the officials in charge, regardless of how they arrived at these decisions, as heretical. It was heresy. He was an apostate. It was apostasy, basically. It was decidedly non-Christian, anti-Christian, against God. Now, whether that's true or not, whether these are things, might be subject to debate. I'm sure there's still a lot of devout Roman Catholics, and possibly the official position of the Roman Catholic Church that a great deal of what Martin Luther had to say is heretical. It is against Scripture. It is against tradition. Certainly against tradition. It is against God, by their perspective. But there were also a lot of people that agreed with him, and that might have been part of the motivation to want to stifle the debate. Because if the debate was allowed to continue, they might have been afraid those second sons who saw the church not just as a ministry, or maybe not even primarily as a ministry, not just as a service to God, or maybe not even primarily as a service to God, and it was a threat to their power base, which is very, very human. We have examples of that in the Gospels with the Pharisees, who in those stories realized at some point that what Jesus Christ himself was doing was the finger of God at work, and yet they were still willing to call it the work of the devil. And here, what I will give them the benefit of the doubt were the power-based humans making a very human decision, rather than learned scholars of the Scriptures having seriously considered the things that Martin Luther had to say, demanded that he recant. They didn't want the discussion. They didn't want the debate. They wanted this over. They wanted this over now. And it was demanded that he recant. Now, by tradition, and I don't know quite how we know this, it might have been recorded in some documents, but the report is that rather than answer the question, do you recant? He didn't say yes or no. He asked to be shown by the Holy Scriptures where he was wrong. Basically, he said, open up the Bible. You quote me where in the Holy Scriptures anything that I have said, any of my 95 theses are wrong. And if the Holy Scriptures contradict what I assert, then I am willing to recant on that issue. That's the implication there. But there was no discussion. There was no debate. The demand was made. And he refused to recant. Now we're talking about October 31st and the Diet of Worms, which sounds very Halloween-y. The Diet of Worms and the Protestant wildfire. The Diet of Worms sounds very Halloween-like. But it actually isn't. Diet here actually just means council. So the Diet of Worms actually isn't a diet where you're eating worms. It's a council of worms. Like, okay, so does that mean there's a bunch of worms getting together on the council? Well, you know, again, Diet of Worms is as cool as that sounds as a Halloween sort of thing. Diet as a council. Worms is actually the name of the town that the council met in. So it's almost like, the Council of San Diego, the Council of Los Angeles, the Council of New York. It sounds pretty Halloween-y cool, but it actually has nothing to do with that. The Diet of Worms is the council that took place in a town of Worms. So the council of this particular town, Martin Luther was excommunicated as a heretic at the Diet of Worms. Excommunicated. Now that was pretty serious back in that day, because excommunication was traditionally interpreted as, you are now damned. Heaven is denied you. The church has basically blocked you from entering into heaven because of that popular conception that you have mankind and you have God, and between the two you have the church as the arbiter between God and man and God. And without the permission and the consent of the church, you were not going to get into heaven. So excommunication was considered very, very serious by your hardcore committed Catholic. And Martin Luther was excommunicated. And his excommunication, combined with his refusal to recant on the basis that he believed he could not be shown to be wrong by the Holy Scriptures, rather than silence him, gave him an audience. And that audience, listening to what he had to say, other like-minded people, like-minded scholars, like-minded, very learned people, also rising up with their own thoughts, their own opinions, which includes such luminaries as John Calvin, started this Protestant wildfire across Europe. And the Reformation shifted from an attempt to reform the Catholic Church to a Protestant Reformation, a Protestant revolution in one decree. Luther was convinced. He hoped to bring Reformation to the Catholic Church, and he had been listened to and engaged in academic debate. As was the tradition, things might have been different had they listened, had they debated, had they discussed. And had they done that, maybe none, maybe some, maybe all of his ideas might have been adopted by, or at least found acceptable, as an acceptable position, but at variance with maybe the official stance of the Catholic Church. But what the Diet of Worms ended up doing, whether it was their intention or not, presumably not, was it created an all or nothing scenario. Luther had to recant or be cast out. He had to say, I was wrong in all my points. I withdraw everything I asserted. And I acknowledge it as being completely wrong and against God. Or he could stand by his position and be cast out. All or nothing. And he had to make a choice. Now this wasn't just some random opinion he had kind of developed on his own, one weekend and went and posted some ideas. What he had posted in his 95 Theses was as a result of literally years of study, years of consideration, and how many years and how much study we'll get into shortly. Luther would not recant. And suddenly Luther was no longer criticizing Catholicism as a Catholic monk, no longer coming as, I am one of you. I am one of you committed to Christ, committed to the church. We need to fix these things. And it put him outside, officially in protest against the church itself. It made him an enemy rather than an ally with a varying opinion. The 95 Theses being nailed to the door is traditionally what sparked the Protestant Reformation. Traditionally, October 31st, in addition to being Halloween, is also Reformation Day. And in 2017, October 31st, Reformation Day in 2017, Protestantism will be officially 500 years old. But rather than the 95 Theses being nailed to the castle church door, it may well be true it was the diet of worms that transformed what might otherwise have been a debate within Catholicism into that Protestant wildfire that would spread through Europe for the rest of the century. 500 years old in 2017. Half a millennium, which now is about a quarter of Christian history. Protestantism has been a major shaper of and a force in global Christianity. So there's some lessons in here. An important lesson is that sometimes what you resist persists. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes you can resist something adequately enough, it doesn't persist. We're told in the scriptures, resist the devil and he must flee. But sometimes that which you resist, rather than be extinguished, it persists. By the way the diet of worms handled the issue, they turned a disagreement into open conflict. They turned varying opinions into a war. A huge percentage of the culture was ready to rally. And what could have been a series of relatively isolated debates within Catholicism turned into a massive movement in protest against Catholicism. Rather than being a reformation among Catholics to maybe do Catholicism a bit differently, to have maybe a different expression still under the authority of the Pope, under the authority of the cardinals and the bishops, turned into a split from the church and doing it completely different in opposition to and completely out from under the authority of the popes, cardinals, and bishops in the church. So here's a fairly simple and pretty direct application. Understand, define, be understood. Have a dialogue. Understand someone else's position. Define any ambiguous terms, and then seek to be understood, rather than jump to judgment and pick the fight. Understand, define, be understood. Having a dialogue, seeking to understand the other position first. Creating definitions you can work with so you can communicate effectively, and then seek to be understood. Defining terms, then seeking to be understood after you understand the other side. Hearing Martin Luther out and having the discussion, having the debate, being able to show point by point down his 95 Theses where he was in error. Making certain assertions, having the discussion, might have avoided the entire Protestant Reformation. Might have protected Catholicism, the unity of Christianity under one holy church, might have been preserved just by understand, define, be understood. But to do this, you must be willing to listen. To listen elegantly, you have to at least entertain this idea. We have a point. You may also have a point. Had Luther been heard out, the Catholic Church may have understood his points. But they wouldn't acknowledge that maybe he had a point. Maybe there was something to back up his positions. Maybe his 95 Theses had some substance behind it. Maybe we should hear this out. Maybe he's right. At the very least, we can understand how he and those like him support their side. So even if you're coming from that position of we want to be able to show them the error of their ways, it is almost impossible to really have someone else understand the error of their ways if they feel you don't understand where they're coming from. If you jump to judgment, if you jump to telling them they're wrong, without hearing them out. Had Luther been heard out, the Catholic Church would have been better situated to discuss his position, to present their counterpoints to his 95 Theses, and to demonstrate the conflict in positions by actually backing it up with your points. And rather than do that, they reflexively fought. They reflexively brought their power to bear, their authority to bear. They went head to head with him without discussion, without understanding. And then they officially sundered the relationship. They officially split with him. They cast him out. Probably, I suspect, thinking the matter's resolved. It's a done deal. He's gone. We don't have to worry about him anymore. What they ended up doing is they created an outside enemy where once they merely had an internal critic. The power of a primary question. Martin Luther was trained as a lawyer. He attended the University of Erfurt from 1501 to 1504, training as a lawyer. He had promised to become a monk if he was delivered from a particularly frightening storm that he thought really might kill him. And he promised that if you will deliver me from the storm, I will become a monk. And he was delivered from the storm. Of course, he survived. And he kept his word. And he became a monk. He entered an Augustinian monastery where he obtained a doctorate of theology. However, he was troubled by his own primary question. His primary question, written again and again in his diary, is, how can a man find favor with God? Again and again he asked, how can a man find favor with God? And that question haunted him. Now, primary questions. All of us have some questions that we ask, and sometimes we have a primary question, a dominant question, one that so consumes elements of our life that it's our go-to question we ask. For Martin Luther, his question was, how can a man find favor with God? He desired favor with God. That to him was his core relationship. That's what he sought. That's what he hungered for. And he kept not finding an answer. Primary questions can be healthy or unhealthy. Luther's dominated his life, and so does ours. Whether we like it or not. And whether we are aware of it or not. Many people have their primary question created for them as a child. Perhaps a parent asked it over and over again. Perhaps the kid arrived at it himself. Really bad primary questions can thus arise. If when you were growing up, your parents asked you again and again, any time you did anything that annoyed them or upset them, that they didn't like, that they didn't want, even if what you're doing was a perfectly normal kid thing, and they kept asking the question, like, what's wrong with you? That might become your primary question. You grow up wondering, every time something doesn't go your way, every time you do something that annoys anyone, which is pretty much anything you can do, you might hear that question in your head, like, what's wrong with me? And in that question is a presumption that something's wrong with you, that somehow you're broken, somehow you're messed up. Unhealthy parents tend to ask unhealthy questions. Infants tend to have infantile thinking. Children tend to have childish thinking. Adolescents tend to have adolescent thinking. Young people tend to have immature thinking, and untrained, uneducated, or uninformed people tend to have unsophisticated thinking. So imagine if you got your primary question from an unhealthy parent. Imagine if you developed your primary question at some very, very young age, where maybe your thinking was still infantile, or your thinking was still childish, or your thinking was still adolescent, or your thinking was immature and sophisticated, and that primary question still haunts you. may be a primary question such as, what the heck is wrong with me? Why am I so messed up? Why am I such a failure? And primary questions like that can sabotage your life. On the other hand, what if you got a primary question such as, how can I make this better? Well, that can be a very empowering primary question. How can I make this better? But if you get that question, say that question is put forth by your parents, if you still have infantile or childish thinking, you might develop a perfectionist mentality. I have to make it better. It's not acceptable the way it is. I'm not okay unless I can make it better and better and better. And why might that happen, even with a healthy parent? Well, because infants have infantile thinking. Children have childish thinking. Adolescents have adolescent thinking. It could just be immature. It could be unsophisticated. As an adult, if we choose our primary question, we can choose a much more empowering primary question. As Christians, we can choose much more empowering questions. Martin Luther's question is, how can a man find favor with God? And as it applied to him personally, he was walking out more specifically for himself. How can I find favor with God? And if he could figure that out, he might have the answer to how can a man find favor with God. So that he could teach, so that he could lead, so he could help others with this answer. So what's your primary question? Do you have one that you're aware of? Is it a good one, an empowering one, a powerful one? Is it a negative one? A disempowering one? A hurtful one? Where did it come from? Did it come from an unhealthy parent, perhaps? An unhealthy teacher? Someone who was reacting to you emotionally? Did you develop it at a time when your thinking perhaps was infantile, childish, adolescent, immature, or unsophisticated? What might be a better primary question? So you can consider, what is your primary question? And if you find that your primary question isn't helpful to you, if it's damaging to you, what could your primary question be? Aspirational. If you're going to aspire to a great primary question, your go-to question you were going to use whenever you responded to something. Because imagine if, hypothetically, you actually made a mistake. Oh, that would be all of us. If you make a mistake, if you blow it, if you have a bad day and your first question is, what is wrong with me? Well, that's probably not going to help you fix it. If, on the other hand, you have exactly the same day and your question is, how do I make this better? How do I learn from this? How do I become more from the lessons that I am learning? Questions like these will drive you forward, lift you higher, cause you to seek answers rather than just seek judgment. Primary questions could sometimes be reflected in the primary questions we ask of others. If I reflexively jump to judgment with my wife, or my wife with me, or either of us with our children, we could be reinforcing or installing a primary question in them. But here's something else. We might also be reflecting the primary question we have for ourselves. So you can seek that out too. The power of a personal quest. So in addition to primary question, consider a personal quest. Luther sought answers to his primary question. Martin Luther fully and zealously applied all the things the church of his day taught. He sought the answer. How does a man find favor with God? How do I find favor with God? Let me seek this answer for myself, and I will have an answer I can share with others, that others around me can also find favor with God. He devoted himself to an exceedingly pious lifestyle by the standards of his day. He would fast 10 to 15 days at a time. That he was taught, if you will deny the flesh, by as simple a technique as fasting that will help you draw nearer to God. That denying your body causes reliance upon the Spirit. And by the way, this is something that's still taught, still believed, that fasting and praying, devoting yourself to prayer during the time you otherwise might be eating, the spiritual discipline of spirit over body, that my body says, feed me, and you decide, no, you don't need food to live. You want it, you crave it, I choose. And that's fasting. Now, you can also do fasting by fasting from particular things. You can do a vegetable fast where you eat vegetables and you deny your body all the junk food and all the other stuff it might like. It can be as simple a thing as a junk food fast. You're just going to not have any junk food. And you still might crave it. You might want it. And it's a simple spiritual discipline of spirit, will, over body. He would fast for 10 to 15 days at a time. There was another teaching that if you will punish the body, if you will punish the flesh, if you will put it through hardship, that will enhance the spiritual. So he would sleep outside without a blanket in freezing temperatures, as he was taught. He would literally beat his body until it was black and blue and bleeding, because that was something that was taught. That if you will punish the flesh, if you will inflict pain on the flesh, at some point you will find that place of grace, that place of peace, where the things of the material no longer matter to you, where the body no longer matters to you, and the idea being that then that would put you in touch with the Spirit. Now, some of this thinking could have arisen from martyrdom. A lot of people who have been martyred, a lot of people who have been tortured for Christ, had reported, sometimes on their way to dying, that they felt the power and the presence of God. And they truly felt the presence of His grace. And these stories go all the way back to the earliest days of the torture and torment of Christians. Even being burned at the stake. That they found a peace in that moment of pain. And that this teaching then was, well, then if we inflict it upon ourselves, we will find it. Martin Luther would go to confession. Again and again, every day. So many times a day that the abbot is reported of having said, Martin, either go out and commit a sin worth confessing or stop coming here so often. You can imagine. And yet Martin Luther found no peace. And thus Martin Luther kept searching. So a lesson here. He went all in. Luther learned. He fully understood. He threw himself into the lessons he was taught wholeheartedly. He did everything he knew to do. He didn't just look at something and think about it intellectually and say, well, I don't really see how that would work. He actually did what he was taught. He did what he was told would work, or at least might work. These days, we often run into people who are quick to judge, who are quick to criticize, quick to say a thing won't work, quick to judge others, when they have very little actual understanding. They don't know. They've never been there. They've never done that. They're looking for excuses. They're looking to tear down people's views, whether they think they're doing that on purpose or not. That's the effect of what they're doing. They go, oh, well, that wouldn't work. That's just wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. But Luther not only understood on a theoretical level, he didn't just think about it, he devoted himself fully to the practice of what he was taught. He did it. He didn't criticize it without understanding it. He didn't deem it as something that would not work, having not done it. He did it all out. He went 100%, beyond 100% of what he was told to do. More confession than he was asked to do. More confession than he was even told, please stop. Fasting, praying, and of course celibacy and chastity and poverty. all the normal things that were common to a monk, but also all of these other, sometimes fairly extreme measures. And he continued his quest for answers. He did all he knew. He didn't make any excuses for himself. He didn't let himself off the hook and then criticize that for which he let himself off the hook. He did it. And he kept seeking more answers. When he would later criticize, he would criticize as someone who had been there, done that, and truly knew that of which he spoke. So that's a lesson. Before you criticize, how well do you really understand? What do you really know? So an application here is we get the results we earn. We get the results we earn. Luther sought the answer to his primary question, and he went all in to achieve his goal. He would not have his failure to find favor with God, to experience that favor with God, be as a result of him doing anything less than all he could. He kept adding to what he knew. He kept exploring. He kept studying. He found that the process did not work, and he kept looking. He stuck to that primary question. He kept going to his leaders and his teachers and his search for answers, and then going 100% all out. Going beyond what others might even suggest or recommend. Seeking this answer. And he found it didn't work. It didn't work for him anyway. So what results are we producing? Are we producing the results we're looking for, or are we looking for different results? Are we really going all in to get the results, or are we kind of dabbling? Are we doing what we know, or are we making excuses? Are we letting ourselves off the hook? All in need not mean risking it all. It's not like you have to take everything you have, all or nothing, do or die. Like literally do or die. Succeed or be bankrupt. I mean, you don't have to take that kind of risk. What this means is devoting 100% of what a particular result will take, and not letting us off the hook, of not doing whatever that process is that will produce that result. Now, if you want more on how to set this up and how to do that, see the QXChurch Life Transformation System for more on that. We get the results we earn. We also have the power of a core principle. The power of a core principle. On a 1509 pilgrimage to Rome, in search of the peace that eluded him, in search of that answer, how does a man find favor with God? All those things he had done, he wasn't done. He took a pilgrimage to Rome. There was this particular rite, this particularly demanding rite that he could perform, that he thought might help. And he sought that out. But that was going to take a pilgrimage to Rome, to go there and do this thing. But while on this pilgrimage, he grew ill while crossing the Alps. He made it to a monastery at the foot of the mountains, where he stayed until he regained his health. A monk there suggested he read Habakkuk. And it was there he ran into Habakkuk 2:4. The just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. Well, he continued on to Rome, and while performing that particularly demanding rite in Rome, that physically demanding, exhausting rite, that verse, that statement, the just shall live by faith, came to his mind with sufficient force that he ceased his prayers in Rome and he returned to the University of Wittenberg and went on to explore the revolutionary idea of justification by faith, that the just shall live by faith. Now here's an important lesson in here. He didn't just have this idea come to him in a time of prayer, in a time of searching. He didn't just have this emotionally satisfying thing and the following October 31st, he walks up to the church and hammers up his 95 Theses, and he just has his own idea. He posted his 95 Theses after more than 8 years of study. It started off with this idea, this one verse he got out of the Holy Scriptures, Habakkuk 2:4. The just shall live by faith. And rather than just run with his idea and start his debate immediately, rather than express it immediately and begin arguing with people immediately, he researched it. He studied it. He explored it in the Holy Scriptures. And it would be 8 years before he reached a point to go to Castle Church and nail his 95 Theses to the door of the church, the community bulletin board, so to speak, that would begin the Protestant Reformation. A wildfire revolution that would spread across Europe, creating and reforming the church in Scotland, which would become the Presbyterians, the Church of England, which would become the Episcopalians, the Lutheran Church, which is the Lutheran Church, and began this new tradition that suddenly it's okay to start your own church, to start your own movement. John Wesley and the Methodist Church, later splitting to the Methodist and the Wesleyan Church. All these big denominations and all these individual congregations, which includes us. He had some core principles that he arrived at. The just shall live by faith. Justification by faith. And that was at the heart of what he had studied, what he had learned, what he had concluded after 8 more years of exploring. Martin Luther, October 31st. The 95 Theses, after 8 years of study, as a result of his primary question, as a result of his personal quest, finding this core principle, the just shall live by faith, and 8 more years of study before he just jumped into debate, before he sought to assert his position, to be that sure. And then when the Diet of Worms told him recant, he didn't just have an emotional opinion that came to him over the weekend. He had 8 years of study backing him up, which is why he was unwilling to recant. He was that sure. He was more willing to be excommunicated than he was willing to recant. So a question for us. What is our primary question? We might have more than one. We might have one dominant one. We might have maybe a negative one and maybe a positive one, depending upon the circumstances. Regardless of what your primary question is, and rather than even judge your own primary question, just consider the simple fact that unhealthy parents will tend to deliver unhealthy questions. Infants may develop an infantile understanding of something and arrive at a primary question. A child might develop a childish understanding of something and arrive at a childish primary question. Whenever your question arose, just be aware you weren't the person you are today. You didn't decide upon it with wise reflection. So if you don't like your primary question or your primary questions, what might be some good ones you could ask? A personal quest. Do you have a personal quest? Is there something you're always aiming for, perhaps tied to your primary question, as was Martin Luther's? And what are you doing in pursuit of that personal quest? Not some personal, vaguely aspirational goal that you kind of dabble in and kind of wish for, but a quest that you will do everything you know in pursuit of this quest, in pursuit of this goal, this result, this outcome. And if you want more on that, the QXChurch Life Transformation System can help you with that. And a core principle. Do you have one or more core principles? Things that to you are the dominant filter you use to look at life, to look at your choices and your decisions. Do you know your own values and the value hierarchy? Have you made this exploration so that you can see what you actually do and consider perhaps if you wish to do it differently, if doing it differently might be better for you, how to structure that? And I also have an ultimate values workshop that you can tap into for that. There are answers. Martin Luther changed the world with his primary question. Martin Luther changed the world from the results of his personal quest. Martin Luther changed the world with his core principle. Our reach may not be quite to the world, but in our own life, in our own family, our own marriage, with our own children, in our own jobs, in our own circle of influence among family, friends, co-workers, associates, and just people we run into on the street. Primary question, personal quest, core principles. Consider these things, as Martin Luther did.